Millionaire CEO said, "Don't cry, sweetie," to a stranger's child until he saw her mother. Savion Skiles stood just inside the cafe doorway, one hand resting lightly on the glass as he watched the street. The evening traffic moved steadily along Lexington Avenue. Headlights slid across wet pavement while people hurried along the sidewalk with umbrellas tilted against the rain. A few yards away, Zoe Bosco walked beside her daughter. Mally held her mother's hand, skipping slightly as they moved down the block. She was talking excitedly, her voice faint through the glass door. Savion couldn't hear the words, but he could see the smile. The little girl laughed about something her mother said. She tilted her head back, eyes bright, cheeks lifting as she grinned. Savion felt a strange stillness settle inside his chest. That smile, he had seen it before, not once, thousands of times, in mirrors. Savion stayed where he was, barely aware that people were moving around him inside the cafe. The girl turned her head again, still smiling as Zoe said something to her. Savion's thoughts began lining up faster than he could control. 10 years. Zoe had disappeared from his life almost exactly 10 years ago. 10 years since their final conversation. 10 years since the night she packed a small suitcase and walked out of the apartment they once shared. Mally looked about 5. Maybe 6. Savion slowly exhaled. That timeline fit far too neatly, he muttered quietly under his breath. No, yet the thought refused to leave. Savion stepped slightly closer to the window. Outside, Zoe paused near the crosswalk as the traffic signal changed. Mally rocked on her heels beside her. Savion studied the girl carefully, her curls, her small nose, the way she lifted one eyebrow slightly when she laughed, a familiar habit. His stomach tightened. A possibility he had never imagined crept into his mind. Could that child be his? The idea felt almost impossible, yet the more he watched her, the less impossible it seemed. Savion leaned his forehead lightly against the cool glass. "Zoe," he whispered quietly, "let me ask you something. What would you do if a single moment forced you to question everything you believed about your past? What if a child you just met looked exactly like you? What if the mother of that child was someone you once loved deeply, someone who disappeared from your life without explanation? Would you walk away and convince yourself it was coincidence? Or would you search for the truth? Because that was the decision standing in front of Savion Skiles that night. And it was a decision that would change his life completely. Just 20 minutes earlier, Savion had been doing something completely ordinary. He had been finishing a quiet dinner while reviewing financial projections on his laptop. Savion Skiles wasn't just successful. He was one of the most influential technology entrepreneurs in New York. His company, Vertex Adaptive Systems, had grown from a small startup into a global firm specializing in advanced logistics software used by shipping companies, airlines, and retail giants. At 36 years old, Savion had achieved the type of success most people only read about in magazines. But success hadn't prepared him for the moment that happened next. Because earlier that evening, Savion had noticed a little girl crying outside the cafe door. A girl who said her mother was late. A girl who ended up sitting across from him drinking hot chocolate. And that girl had just walked away holding the hand of the woman he once planned to marry. Savion straightened slowly. Outside, Zoe and Mally reached a corner and turned right, disappearing from view. The street suddenly felt emptier. Savion remained still for several seconds. His mind replayed every detail from the conversation he had just shared with the child. Her curiosity, her humor, the way she studied him carefully before deciding he was safe. Then the moment returned to him again. Her smile. Savion shook his head slightly. "No, it can't be that simple," he murmured. "Or maybe it is, because if that child truly was his, then the past he believed was finished had just stepped back into his life." Before we go further into this story, let me ask you a small favor. If you enjoy stories about unexpected reunions, life lessons, and second chances, take a second to support the channel. Tap the subscribe button and join the community here at Mr. Williams Storytime. And while you're here, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. I always enjoy seeing how many different places these stories reach. All right, now let's continue. Because the story you're about to hear started long before that rainy evening. Savion finally picked up his coat from the chair beside him. He slipped it on slowly, still staring at the corner where Zoe and Mally had disappeared. 10 years. 10 years since he last saw Zoe Bosco. 10 years since the woman who believed in him more than anyone else walked out of his life. Savion thought he understood why their relationship ended. He believed he had accepted it. He believed he had moved on. But now, there was a child with Zoe's eyes and a smile that looked exactly like his. Savion stepped out of the cafe and into the cool evening air. One question echoed through his mind. Did Zoe leave with more than just a broken heart? Because if the answer was yes, then the story of Savion Skiles did not begin with billion-dollar companies or business success. It began with a young man, a woman who loved him, and a decision that changed 3 lives forever. And to understand that story, we have to go back 10 years. 10 years earlier, Savion Skiles did not own a penthouse. He did not have investors waiting for his approval on billion-dollar deals, and no magazines had written articles about his business instincts. Back then, Savion lived in a narrow 1-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. The place had peeling paint along the window frame and a heater that clicked loudly every few minutes like it was clearing its throat. Most nights, the only light inside came from the glow of 2 computer monitors sitting on a small desk pushed against the wall. Savion leaned forward in his chair, typing quickly. Lines of code scrolled down the screen as he worked. His phone buzzed on the desk beside him. A text message. Unknown number. Are you still alive in there, or did the computer finally win? Savion smiled slightly. He picked up the phone and typed back. Still alive. Barely. A second later, another message appeared. Good, because I'm downstairs and I brought food. Savion stood up quickly. Perfect timing, he said to the empty room. Savion grabbed his hoodie and jogged down the narrow apartment staircase 2 steps at a time. Outside the building, Zoe Bosco stood on the sidewalk holding 2 paper takeout bags. Her dark hair was tied loosely behind her head, and she wore a long tan coat that looked slightly oversized. When she saw Savion, she lifted the bags. I come bearing peace offerings, she said. Savion laughed softly. You're a hero. They headed back upstairs, together. Inside the apartment, Zoe placed the bags on the small kitchen counter. Let me guess, she said, glancing toward the computer screens. You forgot to eat again. Savion rubbed the back of his neck. I didn't forget. I postponed. Zoe raised an eyebrow. That's the same thing. Eat, Savion obeyed. Between bites, Zoe glanced at the monitors. What part are you working on tonight? Savion pointed at the screen. The optimization engine. That sounds important. It is, he said. His voice carried a quiet excitement. If I can get the algorithm to run faster, companies will be able to route shipments across entire countries in seconds. Zoe leaned against the counter watching him. You really believe this is going to work, don't you? Savion didn't hesitate. I know it will. Savion had always been like that. Even before the company had a name. Even before there were investors. He carried a calm certainty about his ideas. He wasn't loud about it. He wasn't arrogant. But when he believed something was possible, nothing could convince him otherwise. Zoe noticed that the first week they met. She walked over to the desk and studied the lines of code scrolling across the screen. So this program will help companies move products faster? She asked. Faster and smarter, Savion replied. Less wasted fuel, better delivery timing, lower costs. Zoe nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like something a lot of companies would want. Savion shrugged slightly. That's the hope. Zoe smiled. You're going to build something big one day, Savion. He glanced up at her. You sound very confident. She folded her arms casually. That's because you are. Savion chuckled quietly. You're the only person who says that. Well, Zoe replied. Everyone else is wrong. Savion and Zoe had met 3 months earlier in a small neighborhood cafe near her fashion school. Savion had been sitting alone with his laptop, typing furiously. Zoe had been sketching clothing designs in a notebook at the next table. After about 20 minutes, she leaned slightly toward him. Excuse me, she said. Savion looked up. Yes? You've been typing non-stop for half an hour, Zoe said. Are you writing a novel or solving world hunger? Savion smiled faintly. Neither. What then? Software. Zoe tilted her head. That sounds less exciting than world hunger. Savion laughed. It might end up helping people more. Now Zoe was interested. How? Savion closed his laptop halfway. Well, imagine every truck, ship, and airplane carrying goods around the world. Okay. Now imagine a system that calculates the fastest, most efficient way to move those goods anywhere. Zoe's eyes widened slightly. That actually sounds pretty important. Savion shrugged. It's just an idea for now. Zoe extended her hand. Zoe Bosco. Savion shook it. Savion Skiles, and that was the beginning. Over the following weeks, the cafe became their unofficial meeting place. Savion worked on his software. Zoe sketched dress designs in a notebook filled with colorful fabrics and patterns. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they worked quietly side by side. One evening, Zoe turned her sketchbook toward him. What do you think? Savion studied the drawing. It showed a flowing evening dress with elegant lines and intricate stitching. That's impressive, he said honestly. Zoe smiled. One day I want to design clothes for big fashion shows. Savion nodded. You're very supportive, Zoe teased. Savion shrugged. I believe in talent when I see it. Zoe pointed at his laptop. Same goes for you. Savion leaned back in his chair. You really think my company could become something big? Zoe answered without hesitation. Yes. Savion watched her for a moment. Why? Because, she said simply, you're the kind of person who refuses to quit. Savion looked back at the screen. That's probably true. Their friendship slowly turned into something deeper. They started meeting outside the cafe. Late evening walks across the Brooklyn Bridge. Cheap dinners at small restaurants where the menus were written on chalkboards. Zoe often brought fabric samples to Savion's apartment. While he worked on his software, she cut and music played quietly in the background. Sometimes they worked without speaking for long stretches. Other times they talked for hours. One night, Zoe leaned back in her chair and stretched her arms. You know something? She said. What? If both of our dreams work out, we might actually become successful. Savion grinned. Then we'll look back at this apartment and laugh. Zoe glanced around the room. I kind of like this apartment. Savion laughed. You're the only one. Zoe smiled. That's because this is where everything started. Zoe believed in Savion even during moments when he doubted himself. One winter evening, Savion stared at a rejection email from a potential investor. He leaned back in his chair. That's the third one this month. Zoe looked up from her sewing machine. What did they say? Savion sighed. Interesting concept, but too risky. Zoe walked over and stood beside him. They're wrong. Savion rubbed his forehead. Maybe they're not. Zoe gently closed the laptop. Savion, he looked up. You are building something no one else has figured out yet. That's the problem. No, she said firmly. That's the opportunity. Savion studied her face. You really think this will work? Zoe smiled softly. I know it will. The city lights stretched endlessly into the distance. Zoe leaned against the railing. Promise me something, she said. What? When your company becomes huge and you're famous, don't forget about nights like this. Savion laughed. I'm not going to become famous. Zoe nudged him lightly. You might. Savion shook his head. Even if I do, I won't forget. Zoe smiled. Good. Savion glanced at her. And when you become a famous designer? Zoe laughed softly. Then we'll both be too busy to sleep. Savion looked back at the glowing skyline. At that moment, the future seemed simple. Two young people chasing impossible dreams. Two lives moving in the same direction. But neither of them knew how quickly success could change everything, and how soon those dreams would begin pulling them apart. About a year after Savion started building his software, something unexpected happened. A logistics company in Chicago agreed to test his system. It wasn't a huge corporation, just a regional freight company trying to reduce delivery delays, but for Savion, it meant everything. He sat at his desk, staring at the email, reading it twice just to be certain he wasn't misunderstanding. Then he grabbed his phone and called Zoe. She answered on the second ring. Hey, genius, she said cheerfully. Savion's voice came out faster than usual. They said yes. There was a pause. Yes to what? The pilot program, Savion replied. The freight company I pitched last month. They want to try the software. Zoe gasped. Savion, that's amazing. Savion stood up from his chair and paced the room. If it works the way I think it will, it could prove the whole system is viable. Zoe laughed with excitement. I knew it. Savion smiled. You always say that. That's because I'm always right. The pilot program worked better than Savion expected. Within 2 months, the Chicago company reported faster delivery routes and reduced fuel costs. Word spread quickly. Soon, Savion began receiving emails from investors asking to schedule meetings. At first, he could hardly believe it. One afternoon, Zoe walked into the apartment and found Savion standing in the kitchen staring at his phone. You look like someone just offered you $1 million, she said. Savion looked up. They might have. Zoe blinked. What? Savion handed her the phone. It's a venture capital firm in Manhattan. They want to meet tomorrow. Zoe read the message slowly. Savion, this is huge. Savion nodded, but his expression had already shifted. The excitement was still there, but something else had joined it. Pressure. Over the following months, Savion's life began changing quickly. Meetings replaced quiet evenings. Business calls replaced relaxed dinners. Savion spent hours traveling between offices in Manhattan, pitching his software to potential investors. One evening, Zoe sat alone at their small kitchen table eating dinner while Savion worked at his computer. Savion, she said gently. He replied without looking up. You've been working for 6 hours straight. Savion continued typing. I just need to finish this projection model. Zoe waited. A few seconds passed, then a few minutes. Finally she sighed softly. Your food is getting cold. Savion glanced briefly at the plate beside him. I'll eat in a minute, but the minute never came. At first, Zoe tried to stay patient. She understood how important the company was to Savion, but slowly she noticed something changing. Savion no longer joined her during evening walks. He missed dinner plans. Even their conversations became shorter. One night, Zoe sat across from him at the kitchen table. Do you remember when we used to talk about our days? She asked. Savion looked up from his laptop. We still do. Zoe shook her head slightly. Not really. Savion leaned back in his chair. What do you mean? Zoe gestured toward the computer. You talk about investors and software updates. Savion frowned. Well, that's what my days are about now. Zoe nodded quietly. I know. Savion wasn't ignoring Zoe intentionally. He simply felt like every moment mattered. Every meeting, every presentation, every line of code. One evening he returned home close to midnight. Zoe was sitting on the couch reading a book. You're late, she said softly. Savion loosened his tie. The investors kept asking questions. Zoe closed the book. You've said that 3 nights this week. Savion dropped his briefcase beside the couch. They're considering funding the company, Zoe. I understand that, she said calmly. But when do you rest? Savion shook his head. I can rest later. Zoe watched him quietly. That's what worries me. The tension finally surfaced one Saturday afternoon. Zoe stood near the door holding her coat. Savion, she said. We were supposed to meet my friend Clara today. Savion sat at his desk surrounded by documents. I know. Zoe waited. Savion kept typing. You're not coming, are you? She asked. Savion exhaled slowly. I just need a few more hours to finish this proposal. Zoe's voice tightened. You said that yesterday too. Savion rubbed his temples. This meeting with the investors is important. Zoe stepped closer. And what about everything else? Savion looked up. What do you mean? Zoe gestured toward the apartment. Us. Savion paused. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then he said quietly, I'm doing this for us too. Zoe lowered her gaze. I know you are. Savion softened slightly. You believe in this company more than anyone. Zoe nodded. Yes. Savion leaned forward. Then you understand why I need to focus. Zoe hesitated before answering. I understand focusing, she said carefully, but lately it feels like there's no space for anything else. Savion's expression hardened slightly. That's not fair. Zoe met his eyes. I'm not asking you to quit your dream. Then what are you asking? Zoe took a breath. I'm asking you to remember that I'm still here. A few weeks later, Zoe received an invitation to present her clothing designs at a small fashion showcase. It wasn't a major event, but it meant a great deal to her. The night before the show, she stood beside Savion in the kitchen. Can you come tomorrow? She asked. Savion looked up from his phone. What time? 7. Savion hesitated. I might still be in a meeting. Zoe forced a small smile. You've known about this for weeks. Savion sighed. I'll try to make it. The word try stayed in Zoe's mind long after the conversation ended. The room buzzed with nervous designers preparing their outfits. Zoe checked the time. 7:10 p.m. She glanced toward the entrance. Savion wasn't there. A few minutes later, the show began. Models walked onto the runway wearing dresses Zoe had spent months designing. The audience applauded politely. Zoe smiled for the cameras, but inside she felt a quiet disappointment. Savion never arrived. Savion returned home late that night. The apartment was unusually quiet. He walked into the bedroom and stopped. Zoe's suitcase sat open on the bed. She was folding clothes carefully. Savion frowned. What's going on? Zoe didn't look up immediately. I'm going to stay with Clara for a while. Savion felt confused. For how long? Zoe zipped the suitcase slowly. I'm not sure. Savion stepped closer. Zoe, we can talk about this. She finally met his eyes. That's the problem, she said gently. We don't talk anymore. Savion opened his mouth to respond, but Zoe continued. You're building something incredible. Savion. Her voice softened. I truly believe that. Savion's expression shifted. Then why leave? Zoe picked up the suitcase. Because right now, there's no place for me in the life you're building. Savion walked Zoe to the door. Neither of them raised their voices. Neither of them argued. That almost made it harder. Zoe paused in the hallway. I hope your company becomes everything you want it to be, she said. Savion nodded slowly. Thank you. Zoe gave a small smile. Take care of yourself." Then she turned and walked down the hall. Savion stood in the doorway watching her go. He believed she simply needed space. He assumed she would return in a few weeks, but Zoe Bosco never came back, and Savion never learned the real reason she left, not until 10 years later, on a quiet evening. When a little girl with familiar eyes walked into his life, the quiet warmth of the cafe slowly returned to Savion's awareness. A few customers sat scattered around the room, their voices blending with the soft hum of conversation and the gentle clinking of coffee cups. Savion stood near the window where he had been watching Zoe and Mally disappear down the street. For a moment he didn't move. The past he thought he had closed the door on had just walked back into his life holding a little girl's hand. He inhaled slowly and stepped back from the glass. The cafe manager passed by carrying a tray. "You all right, sir?" the man asked politely. Savion nodded. "Yes, just thinking," but thinking wasn't quite the right word. His mind was racing. 20 minutes earlier, Savion had been sitting at his table reviewing a presentation for a board meeting. Then he noticed the small figure outside the door. Mally had been standing alone, wiping tears from her cheeks with the sleeve of her jacket. When Savion crouched down to speak with her, she had looked at him with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "You're very tall," she had said. Savion had chuckled softly. "That happens when you're older." Mally had studied his face for a moment. Then she asked the question that made him laugh. "Are you famous?" Savion raised an eyebrow. "Why would you think that? People with coats like that are usually important." Savion had smiled. "Well, tonight I'm just a guy who doesn't like seeing people cry." Mally sniffed. "I wasn't crying." "Of course not," Savion replied. "Just practicing for a dramatic performance?" That earned the first hint of a smile from her. Inside the cafe, Savion ordered hot chocolate for Mally and coffee for himself. She sat across from him, swinging her legs under the chair. The mug of hot chocolate arrived, topped with whipped cream and chocolate shavings. Mally's eyes widened. "That's the biggest hot chocolate I've ever seen." Savion smiled. "You deserve something impressive after standing in the rain." Mally wrapped her hands around the mug. "You're nice." Savion shrugged. "I try." Mally took a careful sip. Then she looked at him thoughtfully. "My mommy says people who try to be nice are usually the best kind." Savion chuckled. "Your mom sounds wise." "She is," Mally said proudly. For the first time in weeks, Savion felt completely relaxed. No investors, no meetings, just a quiet conversation with a child who had a surprising amount of personality. The cafe door suddenly opened with a small chime. Cold air swept into the room. Savion glanced up casually. Then he froze. A woman stepped inside, brushing rain from her coat. Her eyes moved quickly around the room. "Mally!" she called. The little girl jumped out of her chair. "Mommy!" She ran across the cafe and wrapped her arms around the woman's waist. "I'm sorry I'm late," the woman said breathlessly. The subway stopped for 15 minutes. Savion slowly stood. His heart had already recognized her before his mind could process it. Zoe Bosco. Zoe knelt to hug her daughter. "I was so worried when my phone died," she said softly. Then she looked up. Her eyes met Savion's. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Zoe blinked. "Savion?" Her voice carried the same warmth he remembered from years ago. Savion nodded slowly. "Aye, Zoe." Mally looked between them curiously. "You know each other?" Zoe stood up. "We used to." Savion gave a small smile. That's one way to say it. The cafe seemed quieter than before. Zoe glanced at Mally. "Did you wait outside this whole time?" Mally shook her head quickly. "No, Savion helped me." Zoe turned toward him. "You did?" Savion nodded. Zoe's expression softened. "Thank you. It wasn't a problem." Mally tugged on her mother's sleeve. "He's very rich." Zoe raised an eyebrow. "Is he?" Mally nodded enthusiastically. "He said he might be a billionaire." Savion laughed quietly. "I said allegedly." Zoe smiled faintly. "That sounds like something you would say." Savion gestured toward the chair. "You're welcome to sit for a minute." Zoe hesitated. Mally looked hopeful. "Please?" Zoe exhaled softly and sat down. For a few minutes the conversation stayed light. Mally described her dance class in great detail. Savion listened with genuine interest, but beneath the casual conversation, a deeper tension lingered between Savion and Zoe. 10 years of unanswered questions sat silently between them. Finally Zoe said quietly, "You look well." Savion nodded. "So do you." Mally looked confused. "Why are you both talking like that?" Savion smiled. "Like what?" "Like people who are pretending they don't know each other." Zoe laughed softly. Eventually Zoe glanced at the clock. "We should head home." Mally finished the last sip of hot chocolate. Savion stood as they prepared to leave. Mally waved enthusiastically. "Bye, Rich Savion." Savion laughed. "Bye, Mally." Zoe paused for a moment. "Thank you again for helping her." Savion nodded. "Anytime." They walked toward the door. Savion watched as Zoe took Mally's hand. Mally turned back one last time and smiled. That was when Savion noticed it clearly. The shape of her grin, the slight tilt of her head, the same expression he saw every morning in the mirror. Savion stood near the window again. Outside, Zoe and Mally walked down the street together. Mally said something that made Zoe laugh. Savion's mind repeated the same thought over and over. That smile, it was too familiar. He crossed his arms slowly. "No," he murmured. But the thought refused to disappear. As Zoe and Mally reached the corner, Mally looked back briefly toward the cafe. She waved again. Savion raised his hand in response. The streetlight above them illuminated their faces for a moment. Mally had Zoe's eyes, there was no question about that. But her smile. Savion felt his chest tighten slightly. It looked exactly like his. Savion remained at the window long after they turned the corner. He tried convincing himself the resemblance meant nothing. Children often looked like strangers. Coincidences happened all the time. Yet something deep in his instincts refused to accept that explanation. 10 years ago, Zoe had walked out of his life. And now she had returned with a child who might. Savion stopped the thought before finishing it. He ran a hand through his hair. One thing was suddenly certain. The past he believed was finished had just reopened a door, and Savion Skiles was no longer sure he wanted to keep it closed. Savion returned to his penthouse later that evening, but the calm luxury of the apartment didn't bring the comfort it usually did. The floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the glowing Manhattan skyline stretching across the horizon. Cars moved like tiny lights along the streets far below. Normally, this view reminded Savion of everything he had accomplished. Tonight, it meant nothing. He loosened his tie and set his coat over the back of a chair. His thoughts returned to the cafe, Mally's voice, her laugh, and that smile. Savion walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. "Get a grip," he muttered quietly. He leaned against the counter. Plenty of children shared similar features. That didn't mean anything, yet the doubt refused to leave. Savion glanced at the clock. 11:42 p.m. He hadn't even opened his laptop. That alone was unusual. He sat down on the couch, staring at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Zoe Bosco was putting her daughter to bed. The same Zoe who had vanished from his life 10 years ago. And now she was back, with a child. Savion closed his eyes. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The following morning, Savion sat in his office at Vertex Adaptive Systems headquarters. The building overlooked Bryant Park, and the office itself was modern and spacious, designed with clean glass walls and polished wood floors. A large conference table filled one side of the room, but Savion wasn't paying attention to any of it. His executive assistant, Marcus, stood near the door holding a tablet. "The board meeting starts in 15 minutes, Marcus said. Savion nodded. "Right." Marcus frowned slightly. "You haven't opened the financial reports yet." Savion glanced down at the folder on his desk. "I'll review them before the meeting." Marcus hesitated. "Is everything all right?" Savion forced a small smile. "Just thinking about something." Marcus nodded and stepped out of the office. Savion leaned back in his chair. The same scene kept replaying in his mind. Mally waving goodbye, her grin, the resemblance. He rubbed his forehead. "Coincidence," he whispered, but the word didn't sound convincing. The board meeting that morning should have been routine. Executives presented quarterly numbers. Investors asked questions about expansion plans. Savion normally dominated these discussions with sharp analysis and confident decisions. But today something was off. Halfway through a presentation, one of the directors paused. "Savion?" Savion looked up. "Yes? You've been staring at the same page for 5 minutes." A few people at the table exchanged amused glances. Savion straightened. "Sorry, continue." The presentation resumed, but Savion barely heard a word. His mind kept drifting back to Zoe, and the possibility he had been avoiding. By the time the meeting ended, Savion made a decision. He needed clarity. That evening, Savion sat alone in his office long after most employees had gone home. The city outside had grown quiet. Savion opened a blank document on his computer. Then he typed a single line. Zoe left 10 years ago. He leaned back in his chair. Mally appeared about 5 or 6 years old. Savion stared at the screen. The timeline could work. His chest tightened. He opened another browser tab. Not to search Zoe. Not yet. Instead, he searched something else. How old does a 6-year-old child look compared to 5? Savion shook his head at himself. He closed the tab immediately. This is ridiculous, he muttered, but the thought remained. If Mally really was his daughter, then Zoe had carried that secret for 10 years. Savion stood and walked toward the office window. From this height, the park below looked calm and distant. He remembered the night Zoe left. She had seemed sad but determined. At the time, Savion believed the reason was simple. He had become too focused on work. But what if there had been more? Savion suddenly remembered something. The weeks before Zoe left, she had been quieter, more thoughtful, almost nervous sometimes. Savion frowned. Was she trying to tell me something? The realization hit him slowly. If Zoe had discovered she was pregnant back then. Savion turned away from the window sharply. That's impossible, he said aloud. Yet deep down, the idea made unsettling sense. Savion returned to his desk and sat down again. This time he opened a search page. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. For several seconds he didn't type anything. Finally he entered 2 words. Zoe Bosco. Dozens of results appeared. Savion scanned the page carefully. Some links led to old-fashioned school portfolios. Others showed small mentions in local design blogs. Then he found something interesting. A listing for a boutique clothing studio in Manhattan, Bosco Atelier. Savion leaned closer to the screen. The studio specialized in custom dresses and small fashion collections. A photo of the storefront appeared beside the listing. Savion studied the image. A simple shop window, elegant displays, nothing flashy, just tasteful design. Savion felt something shift inside him. Zoe had followed her dream after all. Savion closed the laptop slowly. The office was silent now. Most of the building lights had been turned off. He stood and walked toward a door. One question remained in his mind. If Mally truly was his daughter, then Savion had already missed years of her life. First steps, first words, first day of school. He had been absent from all of it. Savion stopped in the hallway. The thought felt unbearable. He took a slow breath. There was only one way to learn the truth. He needed to see Zoe again. The next afternoon, Savion's car stopped in front of a quiet street in Soho. Small shops lined both sides of the block. Art galleries, coffee houses, boutique clothing stores. Savion stepped out of the car and looked down the sidewalk. Halfway along the street, he spotted the sign. Bosco Atelier. The shop window displayed 3 elegant dresses, each one simple yet beautifully designed. Savion studied them carefully. He could almost hear Zoe's voice explaining the fabrics, the colors, the stitching. Savion felt a strange mixture of nerves and curiosity. For years he believed Zoe had disappeared into the past. Savion adjusted his jacket and walked toward the door. Inside that shop was a woman who once loved him, and possibly the answer to the question that had kept him awake all night. Savion stopped in front of the glass door of Bosco Atelier. The shop looked calm and welcoming. Soft lighting glowed behind the window displays, illuminating 3 dresses placed on elegant mannequins. Each design was simple but refined. Savion studied the stitching closely. The craftsmanship reminded him instantly of Zoe. Even years later, her work carried the same quiet elegance he remembered from those early sketches at the cafe table. He took a slow breath and pushed the door open. A small bell chimed above the entrance. Inside, the space smelled faintly of fabric and fresh coffee. Shelves along the walls displayed folded materials in neat stacks. A long work table stood near the back of the room with sewing tools arranged carefully beside it. Savion stepped inside. The shop felt peaceful, and very different from the world of glass offices and constant meetings he was used to. Savion walked slowly past the displays. The dresses hanging along the racks were beautifully designed, but nothing about the store suggested luxury or fame. This was not the type of boutique that appeared on magazine covers. It was the kind of place built by someone who worked hard every day simply because they loved what they did. Savion paused beside a dress made from deep blue silk. He remembered Zoe once explaining that fabric should feel like it was alive when someone moved in it. He reached out and touched the sleeve lightly. Mommy said not to touch the dresses. Savion turned. A small voice had spoken from behind him. Mally stood a few feet away holding a small box of buttons. Her eyes widened when she recognized him. "Hey," she said excitedly. Savion smiled. "Hello again." Mally placed the box on a nearby table and ran toward him. "You came back," Savion chuckled. "I guess I did." Mally tilted her head slightly. "Did you want more hot chocolate?" Savion laughed softly. "Not today." Mally crossed her arms in a thoughtful pose. "So why are you here?" Savion hesitated before answering. "I wanted to see your mom." Mally nodded seriously. "She's in the back making a dress." Then she raised a finger. "But you have to wait. She says sewing is very serious work." Savion grinned. "That sounds like Zoe." Mally looked confused. "You called her Zoe." Savion shrugged. "I've known her for a long time." Mally studied him carefully. "You're interesting. Savion raised an eyebrow. I get that a lot. From the back room, a familiar voice called out, Mally, who are you talking to? Savion felt his chest tighten slightly. Mally answered immediately. It's Rich, Savion. A moment later, Zoe stepped through the doorway. She stopped instantly when she saw him. For a brief second, neither of them moved. Zoe wiped her hands on a small cloth and walked forward slowly. I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon, she said. Savion nodded. I hope it's all right that I came by. Zoe glanced around the shop. It's a store. People come in. Mally looked between them. You two talk like detectives. Zoe laughed softly. Mally, why don't you go finish sorting those buttons? Mally sighed dramatically but obeyed. Fine. But if anything exciting happens, tell me. Zoe folded her arms lightly. So, she said, what brings a billionaire tech CEO to my little shop? Savion smiled slightly. I was curious. About what? Savion glanced around the studio. You... Zoe raised an eyebrow. That's unexpected. Savion took a step closer. I saw the listing for your studio online. Zoe nodded. It's been open for 3 years. Savion looked impressed. The designs in the window are beautiful. Zoe's expression softened slightly. Thank you. For a moment, the conversation felt almost comfortable, like two old friends catching up after a long absence. But Savion knew that wasn't why he came. Savion glanced around the shop again. You built all of this yourself? Zoe nodded. Slowly, Savion studied the room more carefully. This must have taken a lot of work. Zoe smiled faintly. You have no idea. Savion noticed something then. The shop was successful enough to survive, but it clearly wasn't producing the kind of wealth he was used to seeing. Do you enjoy it? He asked. Zoe looked genuinely surprised. Of course. Savion nodded. That's what matters. Zoe studied him for a moment. You look different, she said. Savion chuckled. 10 years will do that. I don't mean older, Zoe said. You seem calmer. Savion leaned slightly against the counter. That's new. Mally reappeared carrying another small container. I finished sorting the buttons, she announced proudly. Zoe smiled. Mally turned to Savion. Do you want to see my drawing? Savion nodded. Sure. Mally ran to a nearby table and grabbed a sheet of paper. She held it up proudly. The drawing showed 3 stick figures holding hands. Savion studied it. Who are they? Mally pointed to each one. That's me. Then she pointed to the taller figure. That's Mommy. Finally she pointed to the third figure. That's you. Savion blinked. Me? Mally nodded confidently. You look friendly. Zoe laughed quietly. Mally has a habit of adopting people. Savion smiled at the drawing. Well, I'm honored. After a few minutes, Zoe guided Mally toward the back room again. Sweetheart, why don't you start your homework? Mally groaned but eventually disappeared behind the curtain. The shop grew quiet again. Savion and Zoe stood across from each other. The comfortable atmosphere vanished. Zoe seemed to sense the shift immediately. Her voice became more cautious. Savion, she said gently, you didn't come here just to talk about dresses. Savion shook his head. No. Zoe waited. Savion took a breath. I came because I need to ask you something. Zoe remained silent. Savion met her eyes. Mally is about 5, maybe 6. Zoe's expression changed slightly. Savion continued carefully. The timing lines up with when you left. The room felt suddenly smaller. Zoe didn't speak. Savion took another slow breath. Then he asked the question that had been building in his mind since the cafe. Zoe, is Mally my daughter? The words hung in the air between them. For several seconds, Zoe didn't move. Her eyes lowered toward the floor. Savion's heart began beating faster. Finally, Zoe exhaled slowly. She looked up again, and the expression in her eyes told Savion everything before she even spoke. The answer was about to change both of their lives forever. Savion's question lingered in the quiet shop. Zoe didn't answer immediately. Instead, she rested both hands on the edge of the work table as if steadying herself. For years, Savion had negotiated deals worth millions of dollars. He had faced hostile investors, aggressive competitors, and tense boardrooms without hesitation. Finally, Zoe lifted her gaze. Her eyes were calm yet heavy with memories. Yes, she said softly. Savion's chest tightened. Mally is your daughter. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 10 years. Savion stared at Zoe, absorbing the meaning of what she had just said. His first instinct was disbelief, not because he doubted her, but because the idea felt so enormous that his mind struggled to accept it. I have a daughter, he murmured. Zoe nodded quietly. Savion ran a hand through his hair and paced slowly across the studio. All the pieces suddenly rearranged themselves in his mind. Mally's curiosity, her confidence, that familiar smile, every detail made sense now. Savion stopped and looked at Zoe again. How long were you planning to keep this from me? Zoe's expression didn't change. I wasn't planning anything. Savion crossed his arms. Then why didn't you tell me? Zoe exhaled slowly. Because when I found out, everything between us was already falling apart. Savion frowned. You could have called me. Zoe shook her head gently. At that time, your company was taking off. You were meeting investors every day, traveling constantly, barely sleeping. Savion remembered those months well. They were important meetings, he said. I know, Zoe replied. Savion didn't understand. What does that have to do with Mally? Zoe met his eyes. I didn't want to become another pressure in your life. Savion stared at her. You think I would have walked away? Zoe hesitated before answering. I didn't know what you would do. Savion's voice softened slightly. So, you decided for me? Zoe shook her head. No, her voice carried quiet strength now. I decided for myself. Savion remained silent. Zoe continued. When I discovered I was pregnant, I thought about telling you every single day. She folded her arms slowly. But the more I watched your life changing, the more I realized something. Savion waited. You were chasing something important, Zoe said, and you deserved the chance to reach it without feeling trapped. Savion looked around the studio. You raised her alone? Zoe nodded. It wasn't always easy. Savion noticed the sewing machine, the carefully arranged fabrics, the modest size of the shop. Why didn't you ever contact me later? Zoe smiled faintly. I saw your success in the news sometimes. Savion sighed. So, you assumed I wouldn't care. Zoe shook her head again. That's not it. Savion frowned. Then what? Zoe glanced toward the back room where Mally was working on her homework. I didn't want Mally growing up feeling like she was part of someone else's complicated life. Savion felt the weight of those words. Savion walked slowly toward the window. Outside, people passed along the sidewalk, unaware of the life-changing conversation happening inside the studio. I missed everything, he said quietly. Zoe didn't interrupt. Savion continued. Her first birthday, he paused. Her first words, another pause. Her first day at school. Zoe lowered her gaze. Savion turned back toward her. You carried that alone. Zoe nodded. Yes. Savion shook his head slowly. I should have been there. Zoe's voice softened. You didn't even know. Savion leaned against the work table. His mind replayed the moment Mally handed him the drawing earlier. 3 stick figures holding hands. That drawing she showed me, he said. Zoe looked up. She does that sometimes. Savion smiled faintly. She already placed me in the picture. Zoe didn't respond immediately. Savion continued quietly. She doesn't even know who I am. Zoe studied him carefully. That depends on what happens next. Savion looked at her. What do you mean? Zoe crossed her arms gently. Being a father isn't something you can decide in one afternoon. Savion nodded slowly. I know. But his voice carried determination. And I'm not walking away. At that moment, the curtain in the back room moved. Mally stepped out holding a notebook. Mommy, I finished my math. She noticed the serious expressions on both adults. Did I miss something? Savion knelt down so he was at her eye level. No, he said warmly. You didn't miss anything. Mally studied him suspiciously. Why do grown-ups always say that when something big is happening? Savion laughed softly. You might be right. Mally looked between him and Zoe. So what are you two talking about? Savion glanced at Zoe briefly. Then he looked back at Mally. We were talking about getting to know each other better. Mally brightened instantly. That sounds fun. Savion smiled. Not shock, not confusion, something deeper, hope. Because the truth had finally been spoken, and now the real story was just beginning. The quiet of the studio lingered after Mally returned to the back room with her notebook. Savion stood near the work table, still processing everything Zoe had told him. A daughter, 6 years of life he had never known about. 6 years of birthdays, school mornings, scraped knees, bedtime stories. Moments that belonged to him just as much as they belonged to Zoe. Yet he had been absent from every single one. Savion looked at Zoe again. I want to be part of her life. Zoe didn't react immediately. She folded a piece of fabric carefully before answering. That's a big statement. Savion nodded. I know. Zoe studied him. You just found out she exists. I understand that, Savion said calmly. But that doesn't change the fact that she's my daughter. Zoe leaned against the table. And what exactly does being part of her life mean to you? Savion thought for a moment. It means I show up. Zoe crossed her arms gently. Savion, I'm not trying to keep you away. Savion waited. But Mally has a stable life, Zoe continued. She has routines, school, friends, dance class. Savion nodded. I saw the dance studio. Zoe sighed quietly. What worries me is your world. Savion frowned slightly. My world? Zoe gestured toward him. You run a major company. Your schedule is unpredictable. You travel constantly. Savion didn't deny it. Zoe continued. I don't want Mally getting attached to someone who might disappear again. Savion felt the weight of that concern. He understood it. 10 years ago, Zoe had watched him become consumed by work, and from her perspective, he had chosen ambition over everything else. Savion spoke quietly. I'm not the same person I was back then. Zoe raised an eyebrow. That's what everyone says. Over the next few days, Savion found himself returning to Bosco Atelier. Not with dramatic announcements, just small visits. One afternoon he arrived with a small bag from a bakery down the street. Mally spotted him instantly. Rich Savion, she shouted from the work table. Savion laughed. I feel like that nickname is sticking. Mally jumped off the chair. What did you bring? Savion placed the bag on the counter. Chocolate croissants, Mally gasped. You're my favorite person now. Zoe walked out from the back room, wiping her hands. You can't buy loyalty with pastries, she said. Savion smiled. I'm not trying to... Mally grabbed a croissant and took a bite. Her eyes widened dramatically. Okay, she said with her mouth full. Maybe you can... Over the following weeks, Savion and Mally began spending small amounts of time together. At first, Zoe stayed nearby, quietly observing. Savion helped Mally with homework at the work table in the studio. Math problems, spelling words. Once, Mally looked up from her notebook. Are you good at math? Savion chuckled. Very. Mally nodded approvingly. That's useful. Why? Because I'm terrible at it. Savion laughed. We'll fix that. Mally skipped along the sidewalk beside him. Do you dance? She asked. Savion shook his head. Not well. Mally frowned. That's unfortunate. Savion raised an eyebrow. Why? Because dancing is very important. Savion smiled. I'll keep that in mind. For the first time in years, Savion felt something unfamiliar but deeply satisfying. Responsibility that had nothing to do with business. One evening, Savion sat on a bench outside the dance studio while Mally practiced inside. Her concentration was serious, her steps slightly clumsy but enthusiastic. Savion felt himself smiling. His phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. Investor call in 20 minutes. Savion stared at the message. Normally, he would have taken the call immediately. Instead, he typed a short reply. Reschedule for tomorrow. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. The dance class continued. Mally spun in a small circle and nearly lost her balance. Savion chuckled quietly. Something about watching her felt more meaningful than any meeting he had attended that week. You didn't check your phone once during class, Zoe said. Savion shrugged. I didn't need to. Zoe studied him carefully. Your company must still be running. Savion smiled slightly. Apparently it can survive an hour without me. Zoe laughed softly. That's a miracle. Savion leaned against the wall. You've done a good job raising her. Zoe looked toward the dance studio door. She's the best part of my life. Savion nodded. I can see that. Zoe glanced back at him. You're trying. Savion met her gaze. Yes. Zoe remained quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised him. I'm starting to believe you. That night, Savion returned to his penthouse again. The city's skyline still glittered outside his windows, but the apartment no longer felt like the center of his world. Savion walked through the quiet room slowly. For years he had chased success with relentless focus, and he had achieved it. Yet none of that success had ever made him feel the way he felt watching Mally laugh during dance practice. Savion sat down on the couch. He thought about the future, about the years ahead. For the first time, his plans didn't revolve around business growth or market expansion. They revolved around something far simpler: being present, being reliable, being the kind of father Mally deserved. Savion leaned back and smiled faintly. His life had changed in a way he never expected, and somehow it felt like the most important success he had ever achieved. Inside the headquarters of Vertex Adaptive Systems, employees moved through the halls carrying tablets, discussing project deadlines and software updates. But something about the atmosphere on the top floor felt slightly different. Savion sat at the long conference table in the executive meeting room. listening as his leadership team presented updates. Normally, he led these meetings with sharp focus, guiding every detail of the company's direction. Today, he allowed others to speak longer. Marcus noticed first. The company's operations director leaned slightly toward Savion. "You're unusually quiet this morning," he said. Savion smiled. "I'm listening." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That's new." A few executives chuckled. Savion folded his hands calmly. "Maybe it's time the rest of you handled more decisions." The room grew quiet. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "That sounds like the beginning of a very interesting conversation." Savion nodded. "That's exactly what it is." Savion stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city. For years, he had carried the company forward almost single-handedly. Every strategy, every major partnership, every expansion decision. But now something had shifted. Savion turned back toward the table. "I built this company to solve problems," he said, "and it's doing that very well." Marcus nodded. "That's true," Savion continued, "but running a company this size doesn't require one person controlling every detail." A few executives exchanged curious glances. Savion placed both hands on the table. "So starting next quarter, we're restructuring leadership responsibilities." The room became completely silent. Marcus spoke first. "You're stepping back?" Savion nodded calmly. "Not disappearing, just creating space." One executive frowned slightly. "For what?" Savion thought about the answer for a moment. Then he said simply, "For life." Later that week, Savion arrived at Bosco Atelier carrying a small bag of groceries. Mally spotted him through the shop window. "Savion," she shouted as she ran to the door. Savion laughed. "You're getting faster every time." Mally grabbed the bag. "What's inside?" Savion shrugged. "Ingredients." Mally blinked. "For what?" "Dinner." Zoe stepped out from the back room. "You cook now?" she asked skeptically. Savion grinned. "I'm learning." Mally looked delighted. "Can I help?" Savion nodded. Of course. That evening, the three of them stood in Zoe's small kitchen chopping vegetables and laughing at Savion's clumsy attempts to follow a recipe. Mally giggled as Savion accidentally dropped a carrot slice on the floor. "You're terrible at this," she announced. Savion sighed dramatically. "I was hoping no one would notice." Zoe smiled quietly as she watched them. For the first time, Savion looked completely comfortable in her home, not like a visitor, like someone who belonged there. After dinner, Mally sat on the living room floor coloring while Savion helped clean the dishes. Zoe dried a plate and glanced toward him. "You didn't have to do this." Savion shrugged. "I wanted to." Zoe studied him carefully. "You've been showing up a lot lately." Savion smiled slightly. "That's the idea." Zoe leaned against the counter. "You used to cancel plans constantly." Savion nodded. "I know." Zoe waited. Savion continued. "I thought building the company was the most important thing in the world." Zoe folded the towel slowly. "And now?" Savion looked toward the living room where Mally was drawing pictures. "Now I know it wasn't." Zoe followed his gaze. Mally looked up and waved at them. Savion waved back. Zoe turned toward him again. "You really mean this?" Savion nodded. "Yes, for the first time since their reunion." Zoe's expression softened completely. Over the following weeks, Savion's life gradually transformed. Instead of late-night meetings, his evenings often involved helping Mally with homework. Instead of constant business dinners, he attended dance practice and school events. One afternoon, Savion sat at a small table in the studio while Mally worked on a school project. She looked up suddenly. "Savion? Yes? Are you my stepdad?" Savion blinked. Zoe nearly dropped a stack of fabric behind the counter. Savion chuckled. "Not exactly." Mally tilted her head. "Then what are you?" Savion thought for a moment. "Someone who cares about you very much." Mally considered that answer. "Okay," she said finally. Then she went back to coloring. Savion and Zoe exchanged amused glances. One evening, Savion walked Mally home from dance class while Zoe finished work at the studio. The streetlights glowed softly along the sidewalk. Mally skipped beside him. "Savion? Yes? You come to my dance recital next month?" Savion didn't hesitate. "Of course." Mally grinned. "You better. It's very important." Savion smiled. "I wouldn't miss it." Mally looked satisfied and continued skipping. Savion glanced up at the evening sky. For years, his life had followed a single direction: growth, expansion, success. But now his path felt different. Not smaller, just fuller. The company he built would always matter. But the life he was building now mattered even more. And for the first time in a long time, Everything finally felt balanced. The small theater near Central Park buzzed with excitement. Parents filled the seats while children in colorful costumes hurried backstage preparing for their performances. Sevion sat in the third row beside Zoe. The stage curtain was still closed. Soft music played quietly through the speakers while families chatted around them. Sevion glanced at the program in his hands. Mally's name appeared halfway down the list. Mally Bosco, beginner ballet performance. Sevion smiled. She's been talking about this recital for weeks. Zoe laughed softly. She's been practicing the same routine in the living room every night. Sevion leaned back in his chair. She takes it very seriously. Zoe nodded. That's her personality. Sevion glanced toward the stage. Sounds familiar. Zoe gave him a playful look. You're saying she inherited that from you? Sevion shrugged. I'm just noticing similarities. Zoe smiled but didn't argue. The lights in the theater dimmed slightly. A voice over the speaker welcomed the audience. Sevion folded the program carefully. His attention stayed fixed on the stage. Zoe noticed. You look more nervous than the kids, she said. Sevion laughed quietly. I've given presentations to rooms full of investors without feeling like this. Zoe nudged him lightly. This matters more. Sevion didn't disagree. He leaned forward slightly as the curtain began to open. Children in bright costumes walked carefully onto the stage. Sevion searched the group until he spotted Mally near the center. Sevion felt an unexpected surge of pride. The music began. Mally followed the instructor's movements carefully. Her steps were still learning the rhythm, but her enthusiasm filled every motion. Sevion watched closely. Every turn, every small jump. At one point, Mally nearly lost her balance. She quickly corrected herself and continued. Sevion chuckled softly. That recovery was impressive. Zoe smiled. She practices that move constantly. Sevion couldn't take his eyes off the stage. For someone who had built a company that influenced industries around the world, this small dance recital felt far more meaningful. The routine ended with a final pose. The audience erupted into applause. Mally looked out toward the crowd. Her eyes searched until she spotted Zoe and Sevion. Her face lit up instantly. Sevion stood with the rest of the audience and clapped enthusiastically. Mally waved excitedly before following the other dancers off stage. Sevion sat down again, still smiling. I think she did amazing. Zoe nodded proudly. She'll be talking about this performance for weeks. Sevion laughed. She earned it. A few minutes later, parents gathered near the backstage hallway. Children ran toward their families wearing bright smiles and glittering costumes. Mally burst through the doorway and spotted them. Mommy! Sevion! She ran straight toward them. Sevion crouched slightly as she reached him. Mally wrapped her arms around his neck in a spontaneous hug. Did you see my spin? She asked excitedly. Sevion laughed. I did. That was my favorite part. Mally looked proud. I practiced that one the most. Zoe joined them with a warm smile. You were wonderful, she told her daughter. Mally beamed. Later that evening, the three of them walked slowly through the park nearby. The air was calm and comfortable. Mally walked ahead of them, still talking about the recital and demonstrating dance steps along the path. Sevion and Zoe followed behind. Zoe glanced toward him. You kept your promise. Sevion smiled. I told her I would. Zoe nodded. She notices things like that. Sevion watched Mally carefully perform another small spin. I'm learning that. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Zoe spoke again. She's very happy when you're around. Sevion looked at her. I'm happy when I'm around too. Zoe smiled softly. Sevion paused for a moment, watching Mally skip ahead under the glow of the park lights. For years he had chased success with absolute focus. He built a company that people respected around the world, yet none of that success had filled the quiet emptiness he once felt. Sevion glanced at Zoe. You know something? What? All those years I thought success meant building something impressive. Zoe listened. Sevion nodded toward Mally. But this feels far more important. Zoe smiled. I figured you might discover that eventually. Sevion laughed softly. You always were ahead of me. Mally ran back toward them. Can we get ice cream? She asked. Sevion looked at Zoe. Zoe raised an eyebrow playfully. What do you think? Sevion considered the request carefully. Then he nodded. I think that sounds like a great idea. Mally cheered. She grabbed both of their hands and began pulling them toward the corner of the street. Sevion glanced at Zoe as they walked. Life has a strange way of bringing people back together. Zoe smiled. Sometimes it gives us another chance. Sevion squeezed Mally's hand gently. And sometimes, he said quietly, we're smart enough not to waste it. Later that night, Savion stood outside Zoe's apartment after walking them home. Mally hugged him tightly before heading inside. "Good night, Savion." "Good night, Mally." Zoe lingered by the doorway for a moment. "You've changed," she said. Savion nodded. "I had a good reason." Zoe smiled. "See you tomorrow?" Savion returned the smile. "Definitely." As Savion walked back down the street, he realized something simple but powerful. The life he once believed he had left behind had become the life he truly wanted. And this time, he intended to hold on to it. Before you go, tell me in the comments, do you think Zoe was right to keep Mally a secret all those years? Or should she have told Savion from the beginning? If you enjoyed this story, remember to like the video, subscribe to Mr. Williams Storytime, and share it with someone who loves powerful storytelling. Because sometimes, one small moment can change an entire life.